For 31 years, the city of Wichita, Kansas, lived under the shadow of a man no one could find. 10 confirmed victims, hundreds of investigators, thousands of hours of police work, forensic analysis, and public appeals. And yet, the man responsible continued to live openly, attending Sunday services, enforcing local ordinances, raising a family, in the very city where he had committed his crimes. The BTK killer is one of the most chilling cases in the history of American criminal justice, not only because of the violence he inflicted upon his victims, but because of what his case reveals about the systemic failures that allowed him to persist, unstopped, for more than 3 decades. He was not a ghost. He was not a phantom. He was a man who understood, with remarkable precision, the limits of the institutions designed to catch him. And he exploited those limits, year after year, with patience that bordered on the methodical. His name is Dennis Lynn Rader. Born in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the eldest of 4 sons, raised in Wichita, baptized in a Lutheran church. He joined the United States Air Force in 1966, served honorably, returned home, married, had 2 children, and built what appeared to any outside observer to be an unremarkable life. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree from Wichita State University in Administration of Justice. He later worked installing home security alarms. He served as a compliance officer for the city of Park City, issuing citations to neighbors who violated local codes. And for many years, he served as president of his church congregation, organizing events, attending services, leading the community in prayer. This is not simply the story of a serial killer. It is the story of an investigation that failed, repeatedly, systematically, over the course of an entire generation. It is the story of how one man concealed, within the routines of an ordinary life, crimes that shattered the lives of 10 families. And it is the story of how he was ultimately caught, not by the investigators who had spent years searching for him, but by his own insurmountable need to be known. On the morning of January 15, 1974, Dennis Rader walked to a house on Edgemore Street in Wichita, scaled a fence, cut the telephone lines, and waited inside. He had been watching the family who lived there for several weeks, studying their routines, mapping their movements, selecting the moment with precision. The family's name was Otero. Joseph, 38 years old, Julia, 33, their son, Joseph II, 9, their daughter, Josephine, 11. When the older children returned from school that afternoon, they found them. 4 members of the same family, bound and killed inside their own home. No forced entry, no apparent motive, no witnesses. The Wichita Police Department had never encountered anything like it. Investigators worked the scene with urgency, but the leads were sparse, and the pattern was unlike anything in their files. What they could not yet know was that the man responsible had already moved on, that the Otero murders were not an isolated event, but the opening act of a campaign that would last 17 years. 3 months later, on April 4, 1974, Rader struck again. Catherine Bright, 21 years old, returned home to find a stranger inside. She was not alone. Her younger brother Kevin, 19, was with her. Rader attacked them both. Kevin was shot 3 times. Catherine was strangled and stabbed. Kevin survived by feigning death and fleeing the house. Catherine did not. The 2 attacks, both occurring within the same city, within the same year, shared certain structural similarities. But the methods differed enough that investigators initially struggled to establish a definitive connection.
It was a deliberate misdirection, one of several that Rader had calculated in advance. And it worked. The investigation fragmented at precisely the moment it most needed to consolidate. Then, in October 1974, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle newspaper. It claimed responsibility for the Otero murders. It described details only the killer could have known. And it introduced, for the first time, the three letters that would define the case for the next 30 years. BTK. Bind, torture, kill. The city of Wichita had a name for its killer. What it did not yet have was any way to find him.
Between 1974 and 1979, Dennis Rader killed 8 people. Each victim had been selected in advance, observed, followed, and approached with a patience that investigators would later describe as deeply systematic. He referred to his targets internally as projects, assigning them names that reflected his sense of control over the process. In March 1977, Shirley Vian, 33 years old, was killed in her home in Wichita while her 3 young children, locked in the bathroom at Rader's instruction, listened through the door. In December 1977, Nancy Jo Fox, 25, was strangled in her bedroom. After killing her, Rader walked to a nearby telephone booth and called the Wichita police himself, directing them to her body. He then hung up and returned home. Throughout this period, the letters continued. Communications arrived at police stations, at television studios, at newspaper offices, each one describing the crimes in clinical, methodical detail. The language was precise, the references specific. In one letter, sent in February 1978, Rader wrote, "How many do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention?" The Wichita Police Department assembled a dedicated task force. A public hotline received thousands of tips. Investigators pursued dozens of leads, many of them circling back to the same inconclusive evidence. A geographic analysis, conducted in the late 1970s, suggested that the killer likely lived or worked within a specific zone of Wichita. Dennis Rader lived within that zone. He was never interviewed. Then, in 1979, following an attempted attack on a woman named Anna Williams, who survived only because she was not home at the time, the letters stopped. The killings appeared to stop, and the BTK killer, as suddenly and silently as he had emerged, went quiet. The investigation did not close, but without new communications, without new evidence, and without a clear suspect, it entered a state of suspension from which it would not emerge for 2 decades. What Wichita did not know, what no one around him knew, was that Dennis Rader had not gone anywhere. He remained in Park City. He continued working, continued building a life that appeared in every visible respect to be that of an ordinary man. For 14 years, from 1974 to 1988, he worked for ADT's security services, installing home alarm systems throughout the Wichita area. Many of his clients were homeowners who had sought out ADT specifically because of the fear generated by the BTK murders. Rader entered their homes, assessed their vulnerabilities, recommended protective measures, and left with precise knowledge of what those measures could and could not prevent. He later became a compliance officer for the city of Park City, a role that invested him with formal authority over his neighbors. He issued citations for overgrown lawns, improperly stored vehicles, zoning violations. He was known within the community as a man who took the rules seriously. Difficult, some said.
rigid, but never suspicious. At Christ Lutheran Church, he served as president of the congregation for years. He organized parish events. He attended services without interruption. He was, by all external measures, a man of discipline and routine, the kind of man whose neighbors would later struggle to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the record that emerged after his arrest. His wife Paula had no knowledge of what her husband had done across 17 years of marriage. Neither did their 2 children. The family they had built together was, to everyone who witnessed it, genuine. It was the life alongside it, the other life, the invisible one, that had no witnesses.
Between 1991 and 2004, Dennis Rader went entirely silent. No letters, no communications, and, so far as investigators could determine, no further killings. What was not known at the time was that Rader had, in fact, continued killing. 3 further victims between 1985 and 1991, crimes that were not initially connected to BTK. Maureen Hedge, 53, in 1985, Vicky Wegerle, 28, in 1986, and Dolores Davis, 62, killed on January 19, 1991, the last confirmed date of his crimes. Their murders remained unsolved and unlinked for years. The investigation continued in the background, new detectives reviewing old files, forensic technology advancing beyond what had been available in 1974. DNA analysis, which had not existed in a usable investigative form when the first letters arrived, was beginning to transform the landscape of cold case work. For the families of the victims, the silence carried its own particular weight. There had been no arrest, no trial, no resolution. The man who had killed their loved ones was, as far as anyone could prove, still alive and unreachable. The case remained, officially and painfully, open. Then, in March 2004, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle. It described details of the 1986 murder of Vicky Wegerle, details that had never been made public. It included photographs taken at the scene, and a copy of her driver's license, which Rader had kept for nearly 2 decades. BTK had returned, and over the following months, he sent 11 further communications to police departments, to media organizations, to a local television station. He was testing the limits of what investigators could trace. He was, by his own later admission, frustrated that the coverage had diminished. He wanted recognition. He needed to be acknowledged. It was this need, absolute and, in the end, uncontrollable, that would prove to be the single irreversible mistake of his life. In early 2005, Dennis Rader sought reassurance. He sent a written inquiry to the Wichita police asking whether a floppy disk, the storage medium of an earlier era, could be forensically traced to its source. The police, understanding precisely what was at stake, communicated back through a published newspaper notice. It could not. It was a lie, and Rader believed it. On February 16, 2005, a purple floppy disk arrived at a local Wichita television station. On it was a single Microsoft Word document titled simply Test Art 1. The content was minimal, but embedded within the file's metadata, the invisible data that Microsoft Word generates automatically with every document, was information that the sender had not considered and could not erase. A registered username, Dennis, and an organizational name, Christ Lutheran Church. Investigators identified the church within hours. They cross-referenced local records. They identified a man named Dennis Rader, president of the Christ Lutheran Congregation, compliance officer for Park City, resident of the Wichita area for his entire adult life. Within days, surveillance was in place. His vehicle was identified. His address was confirmed. A DNA sample, obtained without his knowledge, matched evidence recovered from a 1986 crime scene. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was pulled over near his home in Park City, Kansas. He was arrested without resistance. He was 60 years old. For 31 years, he had operated within the same city, within the same institutions, within the same community, and had never been found. He had been found in the end because he could not stop reaching for the recognition he had sought since the first letter he mailed in 1974. In August 2005, Dennis Rader stood before a Kansas court and entered guilty pleas to 10 counts of first-degree murder. He described each killing in methodical sequence: dates, locations, the names of his victims, with a composure that those present in the courtroom would later describe as deeply unsettling. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. Kansas had abolished the death penalty in 1994, and Rader was therefore ineligible for execution. He is currently incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility, where he will remain for the remainder of his life. For the families of his 10 victims, the Otero family, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wegerle, Dolores Davis, the resolution offered something, though not everything. Justice, when it arrives 3 decades after the fact, carries its own particular kind of weight. It does not restore what was taken. It does not undo the years lived in uncertainty. What the BTK case leaves behind is a question that the institutions of American law enforcement have never fully resolved. How a man could live for 31 years within the same community where he committed his crimes, surrounded by investigators, colleagues, neighbors, a congregation, and remain entirely invisible. He was not invisible because he was extraordinary. He was invisible because the system designed to find him looked everywhere except where he actually was.